Mr. Brickman, thank you very much for joining us. It was 3 years ago this weekend that you, along with other whistleblowers in the Attorney General's office, went to the FBI to report your old boss, Ken Paxton. Since then, it's been a very long story, and it's clear that the end of Paxton's impeachment trial was not the end of that story. We're simply going into a next chapter. What does that next chapter look like for you, and how do you hope it's going to be different than the trial we just watched play out?
Well, thanks for having me, Ryan. I'm happy to answer any questions about this in the last 3 years, unlike Ken Paxton, who just dodges and lies whenever he can about this. But the next chapter for us is this week, the 4 whistleblowers who are the plaintiffs in the whistleblower lawsuit asked the Texas Supreme Court to send our case back to Travis County so we can have a trial, so we can actually put Ken Paxton under oath and depose him, which did not happen in the impeachment trial because Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick ruled at his discretion only that Ken Paxton did not have to testify. So at a real trial in Travis County, we're going to call Ken Paxton. He's either going to have to testify or invoke his Fifth Amendment rights. So that's the next path for us.
What will Ken Paxton's testimony bring to light that was not present in the evidence at the impeachment trial?
Well, the underlying facts at the impeachment trial have really never been disputed by Ken Paxton. I mean, he abused the office for Nate Paul. Nate Paul is currently under federal indictment. But if you actually watch the impeachment trial, the facts of the case really weren't disputed.
Right. Senators who voted against conviction, voted to acquit the Attorney General, will tell you they don't believe that the very high standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt was met. They say that they kept waiting for a smoking gun to appear, and they just don't think it ever did. What were they missing? What is the smoking gun in your case?
Sure, that's a great question, and there was a smoking gun. When we went to law enforcement 3 years ago tomorrow, I can't believe it's been 3 years, we knew that Nate Paul, who is currently under federal indictment, was involved in the renovations of Ken Paxton's home, okay? What we now know is that Ken Paxton moved into that home in July of 2020, but he did not actually pay for the renovations of that home until after he knew we went to the FBI. So think about that. So it was a cover-up. What Ken Paxton did after we went to the FBI was wire a payment for the renovations of his home that Nate Paul was involved in. And there was also an invoice that was created on October 1st that was backdated. So these senators heard that evidence. Chairman Murr made that very clear, and they totally ignored that smoking gun. They also ignored that Nate Paul, again, who is currently under federal indictment, put Ken Paxton's, the woman with whom Ken Paxton was having an extramarital affair, on his payroll. And even worse, Nate Paul set up a fake Uber account for a guy named Dave P., who is also Ken Paxton, so that he could go see this same woman. So, I mean, a lot of smoking guns. The prosecution did a great job talking about the things that Ken Paxton did for Nate Paul in the office, which your viewers are probably aware of, that Ken Paxton totally ignored the advice of his 8 most senior employees and abused the open records process, abused the charitable division, abused the opinions division. And the worst thing he did is he hired a 5-year lawyer named attorney Brandon Kamek, who went and investigated Nate Paul's criminal and civil adversaries.
You know, so much of this case, as you just laid out, centers around this man, Nate Paul. But I think the question a lot of people have is why Paxton and Paul's relationship was so close, and why Paxton, if these allegations are true, stuck his neck out so far for this one donor. When you were in the Attorney General's office, did you get any sense of why Paul was such a close friend or important person to please for Paxton?
I met with Ken Paxton on July 22nd of 2020 with Jeff Mateer, who was the first assistant, in Jeff Mateer's office. And we confronted him directly. We said, Attorney General, stop talking to this guy, stop meeting with this guy. He's under federal investigation. This is going to get you into trouble. And he would never really answer that question. So Ryan, I don't really know, other than I know Nate Paul hired Ken Paxton's mistress, and I know that he was involved in the renovations of his home. But beyond that, you'd have to ask Ken Paxton, and he will not answer questions. He refused to testify at his trial, and that's why we're going to put him under oath and depose him in our whistleblower case, assuming the Texas Supreme Court grants our request to move it back to Travis County.
So let's assume Ken Paxton does take the stand at some point in a trial that may be coming. What's the first question you hope counsel asks him?
Why did you do this? Why did you turn your entire office over to an Austin businessman that's under federal indictment? Why were you so obsessed with anything related to Nate Paul at the expense of all the important work we were doing? Ryan, the 8 of us that turned Ken Paxton in are committed conservatives. We believe in conservative government, and it was shocking to us to see the Attorney General of Texas so obsessed, not with, remember, this was during COVID. This was when we were having fights over mask mandates and school opening and school closings and those things. Ken Paxton wasn't worried about those things. What he was worried about was one guy named Nate Paul. Why, Ken Paxton, were you so worried about him? So focused on him?
You know, I imagine that you, as a staunch conservative, agree with many of the senators who voted to acquit Ken Paxton, as well as the broad majority of the Republican Party. You probably agree with a lot. But after seeing how that pressure from the Republican Party may have played a part in this trial, do you have any disillusionment about your role in the Republican Party or the party's role in the state?
Yeah, Ryan, I was the chief of staff for a United States senator who is the most conservative senator in the country, a man named Jim Bunning. I was the chief of staff for a governor named Matt Bevin, who is the most conservative governor in the country at the time. I have been like in the trenches of conservative Republican politics for 20 years, and my biggest concern is Lieutenant Governor Patrick and those 16 Republican senators that voted no have basically condoned corruption. And I don't want to see the Republican Party of Texas, be the party of corruption. That's why my fight will continue as long as it takes to expose this, and I will not ever give up, because I cannot stand by and allow corruption to happen in this state.
You know, Dan Patrick has been adamant against those claims that there was no semblance of bias or pressure on his behalf against these senators, and that they weighed the evidence and made an impartial opinion. In fact, he told the Wall Street Journal this week that it was not the Senate that had, quote, rigged this from the start, but it was Speaker Phelan and the House. I think a piece of this puzzle that a lot of people don't see is what the House did before that vote was brought out on the floor in the public. I assume you were extensively involved in that months-long investigation that the House conducted behind closed doors. What was your characterization of how the House handled this? To what degree were you involved in those investigations and working with House investigators? And do you agree at all with some of the claims that the House rushed this process and did it improperly?
Yeah, well, I did meet with the House investigators in the spring. I spent several hours with them. I think my transcript was publicly available. The House investigative team was former prosecutors, federal and state prosecutors, people that have spent literally, I don't even know how many cases these people have tried, hundreds if not thousands. They were true professionals. I think they did everything right and appropriately. I think a lot of the criticism about this is just flat out wrong. I mean, at the end of the day, Lieutenant Governor Patrick was the one who decided Ken Paxton did not have to testify in this trial.
Yeah.
The House tried to call him, Ken Paxton. The House tried to call Laura Olson, who was the woman with whom Attorney General Paxton was having an extramarital affair. And those decisions were Lieutenant Governor Patrick's.
And what evidence do you think Laura Olson would have brought on the stand if she didn't plead the fifth to every question? Why is she a key piece of this puzzle? Outside of just the extramarital affair, but going into the real legal and ethical questions that this trial raised, why is she important?
Because Ken Paxton asked Nate Paul to hire her at the same time that he was abusing his office for Nate Paul. And I think that her testimony would have been very relevant to know the circumstances behind how that happened. She was a Senate staffer, I think, as you and your viewers know. And now she became, working for a commercial real estate firm in Austin, moving from being a state senator staffer in San Antonio, moving closer to Austin is a lot of questions there that I would love to know the answers to, and we'll hopefully get to the bottom of it.
Yeah. While you were watching the acquittal votes come down, some of us noticed you walked out of the Senate gallery in the middle of voting. What was going through your mind, and when did you know that this was not falling your way?
You know, that actually is kind of funny what happened, Ryan, because I literally left the Senate gallery for maybe a minute to take a phone call and come back in, but Twitter was blowing up saying that I was upset and leaving, and I literally came right back. I sat there to support the House team. I was disappointed in the result, but when Lieutenant Governor Patrick made his speech immediately after the trial, it was very clear to me that, you know, this is how it was going to be. And, you know, I'm not super discouraged because I know the truth is on our side. Ken Paxton may have survived this impeachment battle, but his problems are not over.
Thank you for clearing that up, by the way. I think we were also focused on the votes. We may not have seen you walk back into the chamber.
Yeah. That's a problem with Twitter sometimes, Ryan. You know,
no, it is. Absolutely. Yeah. It's hard to get the full story in 140 characters, that's for sure. I wonder have you talked to any lawmakers who may have reached out in support of you, either in the House or the Senate after all of this, or are they still offering you support through this continued process?
We've gotten tremendous support. Remember, there was 121 members of the House that voted to impeach. There were 14 members of the Senate, including 2 very courageous Republicans, Senator Hancock and Senator Nicholas, who did the right thing. I have been absolutely blown up by texts, emails, phone calls from people around the state. My parents have gotten notes from people that they don't even know saying, thank you for what your son did, for standing up for what's right. I think the outpouring of support is real. I think the senators were really listening to a small but well-funded portion of the Republican Party. But I think most of the people in Texas know what happened, and I think most of the people in Texas support us and support the House for bringing this.
Yeah. You've spoken at length about the personal and professional and financial damage that this 3-year process has done to you and your family. And I believe one of your colleagues was talking the other day about how this may have started as a $3.3 million settlement, but if this goes to court, it might not end there. Has this prolonged spotlight that you have been in because of this process continued to do harm to you and your family in those ways? And do you think that it may warrant a higher settlement than what was initially agreed upon if it goes to court?
Well, Ryan, the most important thing for me is to make sure that this never happens again in Texas, that no public employee ever has to deal with what we went through. Attorney General Paxton has lied about us for 3 years. So I think what's going to happen is if the Texas Supreme Court sends our case back to Travis County for a trial, I think that our damages are going to be far in excess of $3.3 million. The main component of, or not the main, a main component of the damage calculation is attorney's fees. So going to trial, going through discovery, potentially appeals, all that will probably be well in excess of $3.3 million. But again, it's never been about the money for me. I was the one that fought for Ken Paxton to apologize to us in the preliminary settlement agreement. He ended up apologizing for calling us rogue employees. He had to accept in there that we did what we thought was right. And very importantly, we won at the trial court and we won at the Third Court of Appeals here in Austin about whether the whistleblower law applies to statewide officials. And I forced Ken Paxton in that preliminary settlement agreement to agree not to overturn that decision. Because again, what's really important to me is the precedent we're setting here. And that's why I'm so concerned with what these 16 Republican senators did, because I do not want the Republican Party of Texas to become the party of corruption. This is not a political thing. This is about what's right and wrong, and Ken Paxton abused his office and is unfit for office, and this battle is not over.
Do you worry the Republican Party is now, as you say, a party of corruption, or is it going that way? Explain what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, I'm concerned with the precedent that 16 Republican senators set, saying basically Ken Paxton's behavior was okay. But I'm not discouraged because 70% of the Republicans in the House voted to impeach. 7 out of the 10 most conservative state House members voted to impeach. I have talked to Republican donors from across this state that are disgusted by what happened. I think there's going to be a big-time backlash And the good guys, the good people in the Republican Party, the ones that are fighting against corruption will ultimately win. And I will not quit until that happens.
You have Robert Nichols and Kelly Hancock, the two Republicans that voted to convict. When you say, quote unquote, the good guys, who else are you thinking of?
Chairman Murr, Speaker Phelan, the House impeachment managers. And by the way, there were a lot of Democrats involved in this too. Again, this was not a Republican versus Democrat dispute. The Democrats in this state stood up and said this is wrong too. But I think that there's a lot of people that support what we did. I just think that the outcome in the Senate impeachment trial is not reflective of that support.
Yeah. Well, we talked to Chairman Rinaldi of the Texas Republican Party this week about their calls for Speaker Phelan to resign, chiefly over this, among some previous grievances as well. But, they ostensibly represent the voice of the Republican Party across the state. It sounds like you disagree with that. That is not, in your opinion, the opinion of the entire party.
I strongly disagree with that. Again, I've been in conservative Republican politics for 20 years. The most important thing that we have to stand for is the rule of law and against corruption. There are lots of conservative Republicans that could be the Attorney General of Texas and fight back against the Biden administration with more competent lawyers than Ken Paxton has today that would get the same results, if not better than Ken Paxton is getting today, that also are not corrupt and also support the rule of law. So that's my hope, that's where the party gets back to.
Why do you think, given that there are so many qualified conservatives in Texas without a history of legal questions, why has the party been so adamant in defending Paxton throughout this entire process? I mean, we've seen a lot of money and a lot of effort go towards keeping Paxton himself in office rather than, say, a person as conservative as him. Why is it him?
That's a great question. I have no idea. It makes absolutely no sense to me. There's hundreds of conservative lawyers that could do a much better job as the Attorney General of Texas than Ken Paxton could, and recruit the best and brightest from across Texas and the country into that office. One of the biggest problems is that office today. And don't just take my word for it. The National Review, which is a very conservative publication, earlier this year wrote a story about how concerned they are with the mass departure of good lawyers from the Attorney General of Texas's office and the precedent that's setting in a lot of these big legal disputes. So you'd have to ask the Texas GOP why they want to go to bat for this guy so much, but there are many better options out there.
Looking back at this whole process, the last 3 years, but specifically just the last 4 or 5 months, is there anything you would have done differently? There's been a lot of criticism about the House handled this. Patrick has promised to change the Constitution to put a higher standard on impeachment, higher standards of evidence, rules that the House must follow before they send an impeachment to the Senate. Do you agree in any way that there could have been better procedure in the House?
That's really not my battle to have. My story is what I lived for 3 years, what I saw for 3 years. And I know that Ken Paxton is unfit for office. The House and Senate can work out all those disagreements. I was not involved in the decision whether to impeach Ken Paxton or not. All I did was swear under oath at the trial exactly what I saw. And that was a man totally unfit to serve.
Mr. Brickman, thanks for joining us. Looking ahead to the future, just one last question for you. What does justice look like? We've talked about the settlement. We've talked about an apology. What will it take fully to make you feel vindicated?
Well, there is a criminal investigation ongoing that I can't talk about. So there's 2 tracks. There's that track, and then there's our whistleblower lawsuit, where I do have control over that, assuming the Texas Supreme Court sends us back to Travis County. And that's where I will fight for the first time to have Ken Paxton do what he refuses to do with you and other members of the media, which is actually answer questions about his illegal, immoral, and unethical conduct. Our whistleblower lawsuit is going to make that happen.
Well, and for the record, we have extended this same invitation to Attorney General Ken Paxton to come on our program or any of ours and answer some of these same kind of questions. Until now, we have not heard any response from his office yet. But of course, that invitation is always standing. Mr. Brickman, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it.